I want to stay roughly contemporary, moving a few centuries ahead here. We've talked about China, the Maya, we've talked about, and so now we're going to move to Europe and talk about the Middle Ages. What we're really going to focus on here is the devotion to relics and an interest in saints and relics. Now, a relic from a saint could be a bone. It could be a bit of cloth from a tunic. It could be a lock of hair. And these relics became important to medieval Christianity in Europe because people traveled great distances to see relics. Pilgrimage is a long journey taken for a religious purpose, and there are pilgrimage routes for Muslims, for Buddhists, Christians alike. And the map here, we're showing one of the most famous pilgrimage routes in Europe that went all the way through France and northern Spain here to Santiago de Compostela. At Santiago, they held the relics of the Apostle James, and many people traveled to see these important relics because in the hopes that they would be rewarded with restoring health, maybe a good farming season. Relics were believed to cure illnesses, to protect a child. This really ushered in a new wave of Christian religious fervor in the Middle Ages. So let's take a look at some of these reliquaries. Here we see the reliquary dedicated to Saint Foy, which is faith. She was a child saint. She lived in the 4th century, so centuries earlier, and she was burned to death by the Romans for refusing to worship pagan gods. And we see this reliquary of gold, crystal, semi-precious stones that holds the relics inside. Often we are focused on the reliquary itself and you can't actually see the physical relics. And this would be the high point of a pilgrimage. This is what the pilgrims have traveled so long to see, hoping it will bring them healing and salvation. For wealthy pilgrims, aristocrats, they would bring different gems and other precious items, cameos, to then add to the surface of the reliquary itself. Here's some other examples of Christian reliquaries from the Middle Ages. I love this one in the middle because this is a head reliquary. There are arm reliquaries, feet reliquaries as well. This is the head reliquary of Saint Eustace, who was a Roman general. And he had this vision. He saw the image of the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross, dying to save humanity. And he decides right then and there to convert to Christianity, and he was later martyred for his faith. Body part reliquaries, like this head reliquary, became really popular in the Middle Ages. But what is interesting to me about this is that the shape of the reliquary, you might say, oh, okay, so this clearly holds a skull. Or if it's in the shape of an arm, it has to hold some arm bones. But that's not always the case. Sometimes these body part reliquaries held relics from an entirely different part of the body. It would maybe even hold reliquaries of cloths, other items in just entirely. On the left, we see the reliquary here that's just a small box that's dedicated to the Archbishop Thomas Becket. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury Cathedral. and he was murdered on the steps of his own cathedral by followers of King Henry II. And Henry and Thomas had this bitter, long feud. And so it was a really just dramatic, violent end to Thomas. And he was so popular within the church and amongst the people that he became a saint almost immediately after his death, which is quite rare. Finally, here on the right, we see a reliquary of what's called the True Cross. The True Cross, this means the cross, the large wooden crucifix on which Christ was killed. And there are purported fragments of the True Cross all over Christendom. Oftentimes, during the Crusades, these wars in the Holy Lands during the Middle Ages, Europeans would bring back what they believed to be elements of the True Cross, and I believe that somebody actually documented all of the cross reliquaries throughout Europe and said if you added them all together, there would be, the True Cross would actually be something like 40 feet tall or something like that. The point, though, is not whether this is actually authentic or not. The point is how the faithful, how practitioners actually use and how they think about these reliquaries. All right, really shifting gears here to maybe one of the most famous memorials to a deceased person in the world. This is the Taj Mahal in Agra. And it is a monument, it's a mausoleum that was built by Shah Jahan. He was the ruler of the Mughal dynasty in India, which is an Islamic dynasty that rules India about the same time as the Renaissance in Europe. And his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, dies due to complications of childbirth. And he's so sad, Shah Jahan, that he wants to construct a permanent resting place. And the building that we see here was called the Luminous Tomb in contemporary Mughal texts, and we know it today as the Taj Mahal. Now, this is not the typical funerary practice for Sunni Muslims. Usually there is a very simple burial here, but the Mughals did like to build large domed mausolea. And we see, I think, one of the most striking features of the Taj Mahal is this gleaming white marble. And you might say, it almost looks like a mosque because we have these minaret towers here. The minarets themselves actually had no functioning purpose. They're simply ornamental. The Mughals loved structural balance, symmetry, harmony in their design. So this is all just for decorative purposes. When we look to the inside of the Taj Mahal, we see this center chamber that holds Mumtaz Mahal's intricately carved sarcophagus on a raised platform. And Shah Jahan then was interred next to her. That's why we see these two platforms here. We see all of these intricately carved white marble screens, all of the kind of sumptuous stone inlay. The dominant theme of the carved imagery is floral. And there's actually some recognizable flower species here, but there's a link, I think, to this theme of paradise, creating the most beautiful, the most kind of luxurious resting place. Quranic verses, so verses from the Quran, the Muslim holy text, are inscribed onto the walls of the building and designs, some inlaid with semi-precious stones. That also adds to the kind of solemnity of this mausoleum. All right, the final work that I want us to look at are the Mbulu Ngulu from Gabon, which is um, a country today that is the home of the Kota people in Central Africa. And remember, when we talk about African art, um, we need to remember the kind of stylistic and technical variety from the continent. Oftentimes, the only time we learn about Africa in the West is when we talk about, colonialism, slavery, epidemics sometimes. But we see that in African visual culture, we see a huge variety of styles, interests, and great sophistication in the artwork itself. So these Mbulu Ngulu figures, and let's actually look at a group of them here. There's lots of different ones. They are guardian figures that are placed on reliquaries, usually simple baskets like the ones we see in this drawing, of the deceased. And so these are not portraits of the deceased, but they are the protectors, the guardians of the remains of the dead. And I think what's really striking for us is how expressive and how abstracted these figures are. We see these big kind of geometric heads, and then very striking, dynamic, abstracted bodies. And these would be placed on reliquaries, and often leaders, descendants would go to the resting place of these reliquaries in a village and consult with them as a way to connect to one's lineage and heritage and seek their wisdom.